Good evening, everyone. Looks like everyone wants to be inside the Vatican tonight. I am Alan Ray. I have the honor of being the president of the college and have the honor also of welcoming you to this special lecture tonight. To begin our presentation this evening, Joan Willem, associate professor in our Department of Business, will introduce our speaker. Professor Willem has been an integral part of the study abroad program called Christian Rome Through the Centuries, a history of religious and economic influence. I know she is a long-time hand over in Rome and seems to know her way around the catacombs pretty well. I had the pleasure of having dinner with her and our guest tonight. This program that she leads explores the economic and religious history of Christianity in Rome and Vatican City, from before the time of Apostles Peter and Paul to today's Pope. Please welcome Professor Willem.
It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, John Thavis. Mr. Thavis is an author and journalist who has specialized in following the Vatican and events in the Catholic Church. He grew up in Minnesota and graduated from St. John's University, having studied classical languages. He subsequently studied archaeology in Rome. Understandably, he fell in love with the Eternal City and began a career in journalism with the Rome Daily American, covering dramatic political changes in Italy in the late 70s, as well as 2 papal conclaves. He came back to Minnesota for a few years, returning to Italy with his wife in the early 80s, and took a reporting job with Catholic News Service covering the Vatican. The experiences of the next 30 years of his career, including traveling to over 60 countries with 2 popes, serve as the foundation for his book, Vatican Diaries, a New York Times bestseller. Tonight he will share those experiences, his perspectives on power and politics in the Vatican, and even how journalists could be valuable resources for the Holy See. Let me introduce Mr. John Thavis.
Thank you, Professor Willem, President Alan Ray, and Elmhurst. This is my first time to Elmhurst. I'm very impressed actually looking at your fall speakers list. I'm honored to be a part of it. It's a great thing you have going here, and I see the community appreciates it. So thank you for inviting me. I am, it is true, what is called a Vaticanista, which is a good thing to be. At least I think it is. We are a pretty small tribe of journalistic specialists, and I will skip the long story about how I ended up covering the Vatican, except to say that I was an English major in college, and so I was equipped to do anything in life. And I was an altar boy too, so naturally equipped to cover anything about the Catholic Church. This was back in the day when careers were less programmed than they are today, and so my career path was pretty accidental. I was studying classical languages, and I went to Italy on archaeological digs, fell in love with the country, who wouldn't, right? And decided to stay, and I came to Rome, and the next day the Red Brigades kidnapped the Prime Minister. So I thought, I wonder if they're hiring down at the local English language newspaper, and sure enough they were. I became a journalist. I was there in 1978 when we heard the report, Fumata Bianca, white smoke. I pedaled my bicycle to St. Peter's Square. I stood under the balcony and I heard them announce the name Kero Wojtyła. And everybody looked around and said, who? The Italians thought it was an African and were not that happy about the fact that a non-Italian had been elected. Kero Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, came out and spoke Italian and won them over that evening, and they eventually loved him. I never thought that I would be covering his pontificate day in, day out for 20-some years, but I was, and I rode on his plane. I visited more than 70 countries with him and got to know him pretty well. you know, we weren't best friends, but we would talk on the plane, and it was a rather amazing beat. I ended up working for Catholic News Service, which was a real break for me, because it was the kind of challenging beat that you rarely find nowadays. We covered it full time, and that meant digging deep, cultivating sources, going beyond the headlines, and that's what I wanted to do as a journalist. So it was very rewarding. I really did find myself backstage at the Vatican. I really did have an insider's view, and you're wondering, so what's it like inside the Vatican? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you witness? I'll tell you, a lot of surprising things, and that, in part, is why I wrote my book. You know, I was ready to retire in 2012, and I said to my wife, I've got to write a book because all the best stories that I've told you over the years about the Vatican have never found their way into my news stories that I've written. And I said, you know, nobody's ever done this. Nobody's written a kind of boys on the bus book about traveling with the Pope. Amazingly, because there are so many stories, I could have written a book just about that. And nobody's really written a book about covering the Vatican. I said, there are too many good things here. And I also wrote it because I was convinced that the public perception of the Vatican is really a caricature. You know, the Vatican is typically perceived as this monolithic power structure where, you know, the orders come down from on top, are carried out by the minions, and everything works in a coordinated way. It's hermetically sealed. And this was not the Vatican that I had come to know. The Vatican I knew was a place where missteps were common, where leaks were quite common, thank God. I speak as a journalist here. Where Curia cardinals would speak out of turn, where the left hand didn't know quite often what the right hand was doing. Even the Pope could be blindsided by lower or middle level officials of the Roman Catholic bureaucracy. And while at times this was painful to watch, I always found it interesting. That's what I wanted to convey in my book. I wanted to convey the flavor of the Vatican, the personalities that made things happen, the atmosphere, and the humanness of the place. And part of this backstage reality at the Vatican is that there are strong tensions pulling the Vatican in different directions. In particular, over the last 10 years or so, a tension between transparency and secrecy, between the demands of modern communication and the old ways of protecting confidentiality. You know, those walls are 16 feet thick, and there are a lot of Vatican officials who still think that what we do inside here does not need to be known by the outside world. We would see this every day as reporters. A pope who would give a press conference to journalists aboard his plane, but his aides would think that they could take the actual words he spoke and rewrite them for the historical record. And they would routinely do this. There was a little guy back in the Secretariat of State at the Vatican who would take the Pope's actual spoken words, rewrite them in, you know, more flowery language, but removing any possible controversial phrases. And they were writing for the Vatican's version of the congressional record, which is called the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which would come out about a year later. Not in time for the news cycle, obviously. They had no idea how journalism really worked and how communication today really worked. We would see it in the Vatican's social media projects, and the Vatican has launched many and have done a good job. But none of them are truly interactive. You know, you won't find comment boxes. And it's because, you know, the church, I guess, has been speaking in more or less in a monologue for centuries and is just not used to seeing that kind of reaction there on the page. We saw it when the Pope resigned earlier this year. Pope Benedict resigned. He took this extraordinary, revolutionary step of resigning, and he announced it in Latin so that half the cardinals in the room did not know what was going on. I was told later that one of the cardinals, in fact, jumped to his feet immediately after the Pope announced his resignation at the end of the ceremony and wanted to rush up to the Pope to show him a new book he had written. And someone grabbed him and said, "Don't you understand? The Pope has just resigned." Well, it was in Latin. These kind of tensions run through almost everything that happens at the Vatican, and certainly the episodes I relate in my book. Chapter 1, in fact, the reason I began to write the book was in the conclave of 2005. I covered it. I was there. You know, the Vatican announced the death of John Paul II with a text message to reporters, which seemed odd to me. Since I was sitting in the Vatican press office, I thought the spokesman would come down and say it, you know, to our faces. But I got a text message. Okay, that's technology for you. They announced the election of his successor with a smoke signal, of course. And as usual, you know, they were very concerned that no one could tell, is it black smoke or is it white smoke? Habitually, you know, no one can really tell. It looks black, white, then gray. So in 2005, they said, we've got a fail-safe method this time for you reporters. This is really going to help you because when it's white smoke, you're going to know the bells of St. Peter are going to start ringing. And we all kind of went, oh, good. But then we thought, well, gee, that kind of takes the drama out of it. But anyway, we'll take it. And sure enough, when Pope Benedict was elected, the smoke came out. It looked black, it looked gray, it looked white. No one could tell. But we knew one thing. The bells weren't ringing. And so we figured, so there must not be a new pope. And we waited 5 minutes. We waited another 5 minutes. We waited another 5 minutes. 20 minutes later, the bells finally rang. By this time, the Pope was on his way to the balcony window. So what happened, I asked myself, in one of this most choreographed of moments at the Vatican to screw up the choreography? And after the election, I went and found the bell ringer. You know, this is the kind of thing that bugs you as a reporter. I found the bell ringer, and I found out why the bells didn't ring. It's because he was waiting at his console to push the button, and he got a phone call that said, ring the bells. But the phone call did not come from his boss. The phone call came from a Swiss guard who had been told late in the game, after they had forgotten about the bells, go call the bell ringer. And the Swiss guard was not his boss. And he wasn't going to take orders until they got somebody in the chain of command that was his boss. And in a way, I can sympathize with him. But this gives you an idea of the kind of turf battles that go on at the Vatican. The Vatican is not a streamlined, efficient bureaucracy. It is a mosaic of fiefdoms. And all of these bureaucratic fiefdoms, many of them have traditions that go back hundreds of years, and some of them think they have their own special authority that goes back hundreds of years. So, in terms of organizational efficiency, the Vatican is largely dysfunctional, but fascinating. And that is part of the problem as a journalist and an author. You know, for me, it is immensely more interesting to cover a Vatican where secrets cannot be kept and where cardinals are too candid than a Vatican that runs with machine-like efficiency. And so while I wish our new Pope Francis good luck in reforming the Roman Curia, I hope he leaves a few rough edges. What I'm going to do here is read a couple of things from my book. Then I'm going to talk about Pope Francis and what he's trying to do. And then I'll take some questions. And I know we have limited time, so I'm going to be brief. I mentioned that reporters cover papal trips. John Paul II began the practice of taking 50 or 60 reporters on his plane. And we were the privileged 50 or 60. Our companies paid top dollar for this. We, in fact, always had the impression that we were the only ones on the plane who were paying. The Pope and his entourage rode in first class. We were in coach class, obviously. But John Paul II had a great habit of strolling back and taking questions from us. And you could actually engage him in a conversation if your questions were good enough. Pope Benedict altered that practice. He would ask for the questions to be submitted ahead of time, and then he would stand in the front and answer them off the cuff. But off the cuff for Benedict always felt like it was rehearsed because his mind is that sharp. He would rattle off answers as if he were taking direct dictation from God. And I don't know how he did it. Under John Paul II, we would often travel to exotic places, including, of course, Africa. And one place we went was a little country called Swaziland. Probably no one in this room has been to Swaziland. Okay, that's usually the case. I'm going to read you about a character I knew called Father Roberto Tucci. He was, and he still is alive and active, and he's a cardinal now. He's a Jesuit who organized papal trips. He was the man behind the scenes watching to make sure that, you can't see the machine gunners behind the papal altar because that would look bad, right? And security is a major concern at these things. I walked over, and this is from my chapter called Up in the Air. I walked over and chatted with Father Tucci in the Swazi sunshine, and I soon learned the cause of his consternation. The Mass was ready to begin, but the Vatican was waiting for Swaziland's 20-year-old king, Mswati III, who had a habit of arriving late. As Tucci glanced at his watch, a government official in a dark blue suit approached us. Coming a bit late is considered a sign of respect in our country, he explained. Tucci said nothing. His eyebrows heaved in exasperation. He badly needed a cigarette. The Pope began celebrating the liturgy, and a few minutes later, a cheer went up. King Mswati had finally arrived. Riding along the stadium track in a vintage Cadillac convertible toward his seat of honor. I watched Tucci grumble into his walkie-talkie and shake his head. "Get a load of this," he muttered. I looked up and I saw that the young king was accompanied by 2 of his 4 wives. Polygamy is widespread in Swaziland, and King Mswati always made sure that he got first connubial dibs among the country's female population. 3 weeks before the Pope arrived, Swaziland had held its annual reed dance, in which tens of thousands of young virgins gather to dance bare-breasted, twirl reeds, and sing in an effort to be noticed by the king, who chooses a new bride from among them. For the girls, selection as the king's latest wife was a unique chance to escape poverty, or at least that was the line I got from the Swazi official at the Mass. He also explained that it wasn't as easy as it looks to pick a bride from 20,000 girls dancing in a field. This year, the king, not wanting to rely on first impressions, had videotaped the dance and made his decision afterward. In a bit of irony that probably went right past everyone in attendance, the Pope's sermon at the Stadium Mass defended Christian marriage and sharply criticized polygamy, saying it was disrespectful to women. If the king and his wives were offended, they didn't show it. You often wonder what's the lasting effect of papal visits. I think Swaziland is probably not a good example for those who want to argue that these things change minds and hearts. I have seen the effects of papal visits, and in some cases they're quite dramatic, especially on a political level. And they've inspired vocations. I've run into priests in Rome many times who said, I decided to become a priest when John Paul II came to our country, but not from Swaziland. And whenever we would go to Africa, of course, these were the most fun trips. I mean, Africa is a tough place, but whenever the Pope would arrive, it would be like a 3-day party, and everyone was just so happy. And the governments would often do public works ahead of a papal arrival, especially around the airport and along motorcade routes. They would rebuild roads. They would rebuild airports sometimes. We landed in Zambia once, and as journalists, we would try to be as close to the Pope as possible in his motorcade. So as soon as we landed, we were put on press minibuses. And I was in the first bus, and the papal motorcade took off, first the Pope, and then the security, and then his doctor, and then us. And the minibus started to go, and they had put in new speed bumps at the airport. When we went over the first bump, the bus got stuck. And the bump was so high that the minibus was like a teeter-totter. We had to get off and lift the bus off the bump. And by that time, of course, the Pope was long gone. We never saw him for the rest of the day. One time in Azerbaijan, traveling with John Paul II, again, we got off. Everything was new at the airport, including this brand new double-decker press bus they had put us on. You know, it had all that plastic still on the seats and the windows. And wow, okay. So we sped off right in behind the motorcade, and until we hit the first overpass, which ripped the top of the bus off. And if you've ever been in a bus where the roof has been ripped off, you know that it's a very loud thing. It was just tremendous. And the driver didn't know what had happened. He thought maybe it had been a terrorist attack. He kept driving. He never slowed down. He sped up, and he drove to a safe spot, which was, of course, miles away from where the Pope was. And then he realized what had happened. So they try very hard. One of the things I covered at the Vatican, and one of the things I wrote about in my book, was how sainthood processes work. You know, there are a lot of saints. Not all of them get recognized, but your chances of getting recognized are greater if you're a member of a religious order, because you have people left behind who will push your cause and shepherd it to the finish line. Popes are in their own special category. Sometimes you would think it's easier to become declared a saint if you're a pope, but in actual fact, it's not so easy, because popes are open to criticism. The cause of Pope Pius XII is a case in point. You know, he's been criticized by some Jewish groups and others for supposedly not doing enough during World War II to protect the Jews. Now, there are other historians who strongly defend him. They say he worked behind the scenes, he did everything prudently, he did exactly what he should have done, he saved many lives. My chapter talks about what was going on behind the scenes at the Vatican in the debate over this very cause, because it was actually Pope Benedict who put a go-slow order on this sainthood cause, and it was some lower-level people, including an American nun, who were really pushing it. And I'll read briefly from my book about my first encounter with this American nun. The voice at the other end of the phone was gravelly, with a thick New Jersey accent. She was selling a story, something about a book she'd written on Pius XII. I'd never met her, but she was about to correct that. "You better come see me, dear. This is going to be big." It was 2003, and with the debate over Pius and the Holocaust reaching a crescendo, it seemed like a good story. I did go to see her at the convent near the Vatican where she was staying, a house of the religious teachers Filippini, an order founded more than 300 years ago. Sister Margherita Marchione, 82 years old, but you'd never guess it, came into the foyer not with one book, but with a stack of various volumes, and slapped them down on the table. "There you go, darling, you've got plenty to write about now." She stood about 5 feet tall and wore the dark habit of her order, a black shawl-like affair that she tugged at as she sat down in front of me. Her graying hair was visible under a soft black bonnet, and a pair of oversized glasses made her eyes look like cannons ready to fire. She wore a continuous smile that seemed genuine. "We've got to get Pius XII beatified, Johnny," she declared. "The man was a saint." Johnny? I hadn't been called that since 5th grade. And in fact, there was something about this scene that reminded me of my parochial school education. Picking a slim hardcover book from the pile, she continued, "This is my latest. I had to write it, with the smear campaign going on against this good man. I gave a copy to the Pope the other day. It was titled simply Pope Pius XII, and laid out the case that the late pontiff had prudently and quietly helped the Jews, opposed Hitler at every turn, and practiced the virtues of a saint. Do you have children? They'll love this," she said, pulling out a copy of Pius XII, the Children's Pope, a biography in easy-to-color line drawings, along with a brief narrative. I turned to a page titled The Holocaust and read, "In Germany, Adolf Hitler killed thousands of Jewish people and others. The Pope saved many by hiding them in the Vatican and in convents and monasteries. He also provided them with money, food, and clothing." Another page recalled how Pius once found an injured bird in the Vatican gardens and nursed it back to health. It would perch on his shoulder during meal times, hopping down to eat from its own dish of seeds and keeping him company. "It's all true," Sister Margarita said, looking over my shoulder. "People forget what a beautiful human being this man was. How many children do you have? 3? Take one for each of them, dear." Sister Margarita actually is a great character, still going strong and still writing books. And although in this section of my book she comes across perhaps as a partisan supporter, she actually is a very respected historian and wrote a book documenting the aid given to Jewish refugees by the convents and religious orders in Rome. She's the only person to have done this, in part because she had access as a nun herself. And she greatly contributed to the literature. Part of being backstage at the Vatican is seeing what happens when VIPs come to meet the Pope. I don't want to scandalize any of you, but most journalists who cover the Vatican are not actually there at the Vatican. They're doing it by remote control. Those few of us Vaticanisti who actually go to the press office every day, probably between 20 and 30 on most days. And the people who are actually up in the papal library when a president or a king or a prime minister comes, usually 1 or 2 journalists are there. And I was privileged enough, having been there 30 years, to have been up in the library several times. You know, the VIPs are ushered in, and they're very impressed by the surroundings, of course. They come in, they sit down with the Pope, the photographers snap a few photos, and then everybody leaves and they're left alone, or in some cases with translators. John Paul II had a little button under his desk, and when the conversation had gone on long enough for him, he would push that button, and in the chamber next to his library, where we journalists would be sitting hobnobbing with Vatican officials, the Vatican officials would suddenly assemble and then open the doors and burst in and say, "Holy Father, your next appointment." Pope Benedict, in what I guess was a move toward greater transparency, moved the button from below the desk to above the desk. And I often wondered what it must have been like, I notice Francis has it there too, what it must be like to be a world leader or anybody having a conversation with the Pope and kind of watching his hand as it moves toward that button. You know, one of my chapters deals with protocol at the Vatican, which, as I say, is more a mindset than a rule book. And one of the greatest characters I ever met at the Vatican was a guy called Massimo Sansolini. He was what was called a papal chair bearer. Some of you may remember the days when a pope was carried on a litter with a chair. He would sit in a chair and would be carried on the shoulders of men through St. Peter's Square or St. Peter's Basilica, and it was practical because you could see the Pope. You could have a good view of him. But when John Paul II was elected, he walked into St. Peter's Basilica. He saw the chair and the litter there and the chair bearers. He took one look and he said, "No, not in the chair." And that was the end of a centuries-old tradition. The chair bearers lost their jobs. They were turned into ushers, basically, papal gentlemen they're called. They now accompany the VIPs when they come in for visits. And Massimo Sansolini is one of them, still is. He used to be a fashion designer. He came from the world of fashion. He knew material very well. He loved good silk. And he then came to the world of the Vatican. What I found interesting about Massimo Sansolini is that he would review the visitors as they came through, but almost strictly on the basis of style and fashion. I'll read you from my book. Whenever a world leader arrived for a papal audience, Sansolini was there, dressed in his tuxedo-style uniform with a row of ribbon medals on his lapel. Sansolini watched the VIPs scrupulously, taking mental notes. Afterward, he would pass judgment. And in Sansolini's court of fashion, there was no appeal. European royalty acquitted themselves quite admirably. Meeting Pope John Paul in 1980, Queen Elizabeth was elegance personified, right down to the jeweled E on the sash that draped from her shoulder. Heads of state, on the other hand, were more prone to blunders. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had earned high marks until he crossed his legs during the Pope's speech. A breach of protocol that Sansolini could hardly believe. The Eastern Europeans were even worse. When Polish Premier Lech Walesa and his wife walked hand in hand down the Vatican corridor on their way to see the Pope, they looked to Sansolini like a couple strolling on their honeymoon. And what was that on her head? Some kind of military beret? When Raisa Gorbachev showed up to see the Pope wearing red instead of the traditional black and no veil, it pained Sansolini to give her demerits because she seemed otherwise like a classy lady. US presidents were habitually the worst offenders of the unwritten rules. Jimmy Carter struck Sansolini as someone who had just stepped out of the Georgia backwoods, smiling too much, making too much noise, and moving his arms like windmills. The Americans always seemed baffled by the array of Vatican uniforms, unable to match the rank with the garb. One US president, flush from a papal audience, greeted a long line of Vatican dignitaries, and then with a flourish, turned toward the Vatican's elevator operator, whose uniform featured shoulder loops and silver buttons, and gave him a snappy military salute. And I've seen even worse. Well, I don't want to go on too long, and I want to leave room for questions, but I do want to talk a little about our new Pope. I lost my privileged backstage perch at the Vatican when I retired in 2012. I had this book coming out, and I went back to Minnesota. I moved to a northern Minnesota town called Bemidji, where I bought a canoe and went fishing a lot. And I finished my book. I sent it in. I waited for it to be published. It was due to come out in February 2013. And I began to worry for purely selfish reasons, because I knew that Pope Benedict was theoretically open to the idea of retirement. I did not want him to retire too quickly, because then my editors would want me to rewrite parts of the book. On the other hand, if he retired just as my book was coming out, it would be the perfect situation. So I would sit in my canoe in Bemidji with my cell phone when the fish weren't biting and send emails to my journalistic colleagues in Rome. And I have a record of these emails, in case anybody doubts this, but I would ask them, do you think the Pope is considering resigning? It seemed logical to me because he was wrapping up all his big projects. His last books on Jesus of Nazareth, A synod launched his new evangelization project. He had just completed a cycle of ad limina visits with bishops from around the entire world, and he seemed frailer. Then, in November of 2012, he named 6 new cardinals. This was a big flag to me because he had named cardinals earlier that year already. It seemed to me that he was topping up for a conclave. I emailed once again my journalistic colleagues, and I actually said, do you think he might resign in February? Well, this makes me sound quite prophetic, I know. The reason I thought he might resign in February is because on February 22nd, there's the Feast of the Chair of Peter. It's a feast that is tied to the authority of the papacy. And I thought it would be typical of Benedict, if he were taking such a revolutionary step, like resigning, to tie it somehow to church tradition, to do it on this date. And so even though none of my journalistic colleagues bothered to answer my stupid emails about Pope resigning, because what are you talking about? He's right there in front of us every day. I booked my ticket to Rome, and I arrived on February 10th. On February 11th, the next morning, I walked into the Vatican press office just to hear, in time to hear the Pope resigning in Latin. And my colleagues looked at me very suspiciously and said, "What are you doing here? You knew." And I said, I didn't know, but I would kind of guessed. And so suddenly, I had the book coming out. My editor was convinced that I had gone to Rome, had a late night talk with the Pope, and convinced him, because of course sales of the book went through the roof. That's why it ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. There was suddenly tremendous interest in things Vatican and in how the Vatican worked. And every journalist who came to Rome seemingly had my book and wanted to interview me, and I was happy to give the interviews. So I went from a Vatican reporter to a kind of Vatican, so-called Vatican expert. That's how I like to refer to myself. And of course, people wanted to know who would be the next pope. Well, I had no idea. You know, I mean, it's a crapshoot, really. No one knew. But I knew one thing after spending a week or two inside the press office, that the journalists were only talking to themselves. And I had to get out of there. So I took 3 days. I went around and I talked to any cardinal who would speak to me. And there were several. They weren't telling me any secrets. They weren't telling me anything they weren't supposed to. And in fact, when I was done, I looked at my notebook and I said, I got nothing here. You know, they really said nothing. But I did notice that 3 of the cardinals I had spoken to had mentioned the name, without my prompting, of Jorge Bergoglio, Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina. I thought, now what did they say? They said he had impressed the cardinals because he had spoken strongly of the need for the church to be less concerned with its doctrinal and theological pronouncements, more concerned, more involved with the real lives of people. And he had made it clear that he would deal with the problems that had crept into the Vatican bureaucracy. And so the day before the conclave started, I took a chance. I had a blog at this point, and I had avoided picking a candidate, but I bet on Cardinal Bergoglio. I said, this is the guy to watch. And boy, am I glad I did that. Because it made me look much more prophetic than I actually was. I wasn't all that convinced. But I knew who the man was, and I knew that he would bring changes. And so when his name was announced, and I was doing live commentary on ABC, I actually had something intelligent to say. I think that probably very few of the cardinals who elected him Pope realized quite who they were electing. I think they knew they were electing a reformer when it came to the Vatican bureaucracy. I don't think they fully understood what his vision of the church would bring, or at least would set the stage for. And that is simply because papal conclaves are not political elections. They're not political conferences at all. You don't come in as a candidate and say, here's what I do as Pope, here's my program. No, you speak rather elliptically and inspirationally, and you talk about vision of the church, but you don't sit down and go through X, Y, and Z, here's what I'm going to do to change things. And so I think the cardinals who elected him are finding out, just as we are, what this new Pope has in mind. We've all seen that he's taken a whole new tack on his own ministry and tried to redirect the church's energy toward what I consider to be its fundamental mission, saving souls. And I know that's what the Pope considers to be its fundamental mission. He said some pretty hard things about the Vatican's bureaucracy. He has talked about the idea of a papal court as a leprosy. He's talking about the Roman Curia as being too Vatican-centric. And of course, one of the first things he did was move out of the papal apartments into the Vatican guest house, where he is no longer surrounded by Roman Curia offices. All these things were rather symbolic, and so far we haven't seen substantial policy changes, but as I say, they set the stage for something really important. He's given interviews. I think some of the most important things he's said so far concern what I like to call identity politics. I think really for more than the last 10 years, the Catholic Church has been involved in rebuilding and reconfirming its identity. And by that I mean, under John Paul II, really one of the biggest projects was rewriting the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And this was the book that says what we believe. This is what the church teaching is. And all Catholics were invited to have it and to refer to it, because it was important to know what we believed. And, one can understand that. Under Pope Benedict, the identity politics was honed even further. I think Pope Francis is moving away from that. And that's because I think identity politics for the church have moved into an area where you were excluding people by the fact that if they didn't agree with some church teachings that were so-called non-negotiable, then they really could no longer call themselves Catholics. I mean, we saw theologians who were denied the ability to teach in a Catholic university. Some universities and hospitals were told not to call themselves Catholics. Some Catholic politicians lost their place in communion lines because of this. And it almost became a situation where church officials kind of resembled copyright lawyers who were protecting the Catholic brand name. I think Francis is taking the church away from those kind of identity politics and culture wars and back toward this simpler message of God's saving grace. I think he sees himself not as the gatekeeper in chief, but as the head of a global mission that has to be welcoming and invitational. Even more remarkable, I think, have been the Pope's own comments about his own authority. He was asked about infallibility, and his questioner found himself listening to the Pope talk about the infallibility of the people of God. The Pope made it clear that thinking with the church is not the same as thinking with the hierarchy. He has said that church teaching has to be open to development. It has to be able to learn things from other branches of knowledge, including the sciences, and that it cannot simply be something that you surround and protect without ever changing. Well, these are remarkable statements. They are the kind of statements that, had he been a bishop, he might have been called to Rome to explain himself. Papal teaching authority has been a central element of recent pontificates. I think it's been used kind of as a trump card in a lot of Catholic debates. Francis sees the possibility of developing church teachings as something that must involve not only himself, not only the bishops, but also lay people. I think we're going to see him govern in a less authoritative way. I think he's going to involve bishops in his decisions. I think he's going to share authority with bishops, probably through the Synod of Bishops that meets every so often at the Vatican. I think, of course, I guess the question is, will the rest of the church follow? And so far, well, his poll numbers are sky high. We know that. But we also know that, you know, there are some people in this country and elsewhere, including some bishops, who probably are looking at this as a challenge, a real challenge, because this is a pastoral style that has not necessarily been reflected by them as pastors. And I think their people are going to be looking toward them to reflect the Pope's style, tone, and substance. As for the Roman Curia, I think there's some great disorientation going on there. I would like to end this talk on a hopeful note, and I will do that somewhat. I think Pope Francis has long-term reforms in mind, and if he stays in office 10 years, I think he will achieve that simply by appointing a whole new generation of bishops, by reforming the structure of the Vatican's bureaucracy, and by getting people used to the idea that, yes, if you're a pastor, you need to be near your people. You need to listen to them. People need to be involved. At the same time, the last time I was in Rome, 2 months ago, one Curia official commented when I asked him, what's the enthusiasm level here in the Roman Curia? He said, he's 76. We'll see. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take your questions.
Waiting for Mike.
Thank you. Hi.
Yes.
I wanted to know how you feel the church ever moving to female priest or even cardinals.
So the question is, how do I think, do I foresee the church moving toward female priests or even cardinals? Right, I'm asked that a lot, and they're two very distinct questions. I don't see the church moving toward female priests, women's ordination, anytime soon, certainly, and perhaps never. Pope Francis has said on 2 occasions that don't expect me to change that. That's not going to happen. So he has definitely lowered expectations there, and I think that's logical. And I think the reason is because previous popes, John Paul II in particular, has enshrined this teaching almost as infallible. He's come as close to infallible as you can state in an official Vatican document. So it would take a huge amount of rethinking and discussion and debate and change circumstances for that to change. Female cardinals, on the other hand, is another question. It's entirely possible. You know, I remember a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago, there was a synod of bishops at the Vatican, and you'd always have some cardinal, usually from Africa, who'd suggest something outrageous and would be shouted down. Well, in this synod, sure enough, it was a cardinal from Africa who said, why can't we have a woman cardinal? And of course, in the days that followed, the Roman Curia officials went out of their way to explain why we can't do that. Because current rules, of course, require one to be not only ordained, but to be a bishop. Well, I researched this. Now, you know, the College of Cardinals is an ancient church institution, but it's not that ancient. It's about 1,000 years old. It is a human institution. It was formed not by Jesus Christ, but by, you know, human beings who were running the church at a certain point. Its membership has changed over the centuries. There used to be lay members. And if there can be lay members, there can be women members. So, in fact, that's something that could happen. I personally expect and hope that Pope Francis will enlarge the College of Cardinals because it's artificially small. There are only 120 cardinals allowed to vote in a conclave, and half of them are European. They've dominated this for centuries, and there's no reason not to expand its membership to bring in other people, and perhaps to even bring in lay people, including women.
Let's see if this, oh, good. The microphone's kind of off.
Okay.
Hi, that great lecture. Thank you so much. Do you think in not just Italy, but the world as a whole, the church is going to be able to maintain its power, and the idea of Vatican City as separate from governments, you think it will last just forever and ever, I'll put it that way, and the idea of papal infallibility, as a smaller scale, perhaps, as part of that question. And I know I was listening to a radio show once that in some countries there's no like separation of church and state, and I was thinking of like a Scandinavian country, I believe, where they pay tithes to the church through the government. Do you think this is a good idea, and that this kind of thing in the world will continue as a whole for a long period of time, if not forever?
Well, thank you for all those questions. They're enough to write a book about, and they're good questions. But in terms of papal power or Vatican power, I guess really you have to understand that popes used to be temporal powers. They used to be leaders. The state of Italy is only 150 years old because before that there were the papal states and various other kingdoms. They held on to temporal power for a long time until they had to give it up. They were left with Vatican City, which is a city-state of 109 acres. Is that bigger or smaller than a decent-sized golf course? I can't. Smaller, yeah. It's not big and it's not much, but I think they will maintain their status as an independent city-state. They sure don't want to be part of Italy. As far as the separation of church and state, I think you will find people at the Vatican want separation of church and state as well. They believe, in fact, that the separation of church and state that exists in the United States is actually a pretty good model, where the church has influence, it has a voice in public affairs, but it's not dictating to anyone, and it's not, try as it might, it's not the official state religion in any way, and it's no longer that in Italy either. As for papal infallibility, that's a whole other question. I think people misunderstand papal infallibility. Most things the Pope says and does are not touched by this concept of papal infallibility. That's reserved for special pronouncements. And when the Pope wants you to know he's being infallible, he will let you know. He will say so. And it looks to me like Pope Francis is not going to be stamping too many of the things he says and does with the infallible stamp.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I have two questions, please. I'm over here.
Okay, thank you.
First is following Pope John the 23rd and the Vatican Council, Second Vatican, there was a pulling together of the conservative traditional group within, has been, and that's become dominant, it seems, under the last two papacies. I'm wondering what you foresee in terms of a coalescing of the traditional point of view to push back against Francis, or along whatever, how you want to put that. Second question is, we had a new papal nuncio appointed a couple of years ago. What can you tell him about him and about the prospect for a different kind of bishop being named in the United States in coming years?
Right. Those are really good questions. I'm not sure my answers are going to be able to satisfy you on those because, I'm waiting to see the answer myself. I don't think we know enough yet to know exactly how this is going to play out. If we believe Pope Francis, the kinds of people he wants as bishops are people who are not careerists, who don't see themselves as CEOs or managers, who are close to their people, so close that, as he put it, they smell like the sheep, okay? And there are a lot of bishops when you look around the world who don't seem to fit that description, do they? Yeah, I agree that there have been a lot of conservative bishops appointed over the last 30 years. I think you're asking whether there'll be some kind of pushback or resistance from them. Probably there's going to be uneasiness, but I think they know who is Pope. And I think this Pope knows he is Pope. And I expect that he will, especially when he brings bishops to Rome and talks to them, that he will make it eminently clear what he expects of them. The process of naming bishops is a complex one. It does depend in part on the papal nuncio, who is Archbishop Vigano. I don't know that much about him, except that he was one of the only whistleblowers in Vatican City when he discovered they were spending more than $500,000 to put up the Christmas creche every year in St. Peter's Square to remind people that Jesus was born in a manger. Although he asked not to be sent away from his job, he was sent away from his job. And I don't know much more about him than that. He's been over here for the last couple of years. It does fall upon the nuncio to vet candidates for the bishops. I would hope that Pope Francis will rely more on the local churches to put forward candidates. This, of course, was the way the early church worked to a much greater degree. And over the last several decades, there's been a much more centralization of the choosing process in Rome through the nuncio and through the Congregation for Bishops. And the Congregation for Bishops has a lot of power here. So that, of course, is going to depend on what Pope Francis does with the Vatican congregations. He may revamp all of that. It's going to take some time to answer your questions.
During the last several years of Pope John Paul's II reign, obviously, he was physically in very difficult circumstances, and the perception was that his ability to fulfill the ordinary functions of the papacy were clearly limited. As you were there, I wondered if you had any impressions about who helped or who sort of took over or moved in to take on or to carry out the functions that he wasn't able to. And the second part of it was, although it's probably speculative, do you think that that episode where the church appeared, at least to many of us, to be in the hands of a pope who unfortunately was dealing with very difficult physical circumstances, do you think that could have influenced Benedict's decision?
Right. Those are good questions, too. I think as John Paul II gradually was incapacitated by his illness, Parkinson's, it was very tough for him. He had an almost mystical relationship with his office. He felt he will stay till the end and God will preserve him to the end. And in a way, he was right. I mean, he was at his window a week before he died. And it was very moving. It's true that he wasn't able, perhaps, to govern the way a pope normally would govern and to manage things the way a pope should have been managing things. On the other hand, he gave a tremendous witness of suffering to the world that was very valuable, and there are still people at the Vatican who believe that was worth it. As for who was calling the shots, I think that was a question that was floating around the Vatican a lot at that time. It became a very, very restricted number of people who had access to the Pope, including, of course, his private secretary, who is now a Cardinal, Stanislaw Dziwisz of Krakow. He was the gatekeeper, and it became much more difficult to get an appointment with the Pope or to get business done. Yes, I think it influenced Pope Benedict's decision to resign. I think my own opinion is that Benedict probably had resignation in mind from the day he was elected. And the reason I think this is because Benedict was a rationalist. As Cardinal Ratzinger, he watched this Polish Pope suffer, and I'm sure he felt the same way. He felt torn. He saw the witness of suffering. He saw that it was beautiful in some ways, but he also saw that it could damage the church. If a pope has a stroke, if a pope is, has to disappear for months at a time or years, and I think he saw the inevitability of this happening in the modern age. And so as a rationalist, he, I believe, looked at the office of the papacy and said, I can do the church a tremendous favor by resigning at a point where I think my own powers are not up to the task. And I think that's exactly what he did. And he picked the moment, and I think it was a great gesture of humility, and I think it was a very useful gesture for the future of the church.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have two questions. First of all, how has your experience as a Vatican reporter affected you as a Catholic? And the second question I have, well, it's not a question. I'm asking you if you would respond to the new translation.
Well, the second question first, I'll be very brief. The new translation really throws me because I went to church in Italy in Italian, and now I'm just meeting this new translation, having moved back here. Yeah, it throws me. I'm not thrilled by it. On the other hand, I was an altar boy. I learned Latin, so, you know, these things change. I think people will get used to it, and you know, changing back again, I'm not sure is the way to go. I think it's going to take some time before that happens. As for my own faith experience, a lot of people, including my friends, would ask me, how could you still be a Catholic after covering the Vatican all those years? And maybe that's part of what's behind your question, too. I actually was not really scandalized by too much I saw at the Vatican. The Vatican is full of very good people as well as incompetent people and as well as people who are not so great. Okay? It's a human microcosm. They're human beings. Many of them are trying very hard to push the Vatican in the right direction. So, you know, obviously I've seen scandals. I've seen the way they handled the sex abuse scandals at the beginning was terribly disheartening, dispiriting, not just to me. But I've seen dumb things happen at the Vatican all the time. But my own personal faith, you know, it never depended on, you know, how well a Vatican official performed his job. You know, that's in a separate realm.
This will be our last question.
This is a more plebeian question, I think, than has been asked, much simpler. Could you comment on the possibility or the improbability of an American Pope?
An American Pope. Those words were taboo until recently. It's very interesting. When I first came to Rome, you would sometimes get that, you know, well, what about an American Pope? And it would be laughed off. There would be no chance, an American Pope, never. That was not true at this last conclave. And I'll tell you why. My theory is that the problems had accumulated to the point at the Vatican, and I think actually my book, although it didn't set out to do this, documents a lot of these problems. They had reached a critical mass, and I think people realized that we need someone who is a problem solver. Well, what are Americans good for, right? Americans are problem solvers. This idea of reaching out, getting expert advice, and then implementing things, that's an American way of doing things that had been foreign to the Vatican to a large degree. And therefore, I think that's one of the reasons why we saw a couple of names bandied about seriously during the run-up to the conclave, Cardinal Dolan of New York and Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston. Cardinal O'Malley in particular was much beloved by Italians. You would have thought Italians would have rallied around an Italian, okay, because this is their chance to get the papacy back. It didn't happen. You know, none of the Italians seemed to inspire a great deal of enthusiasm among Italian Catholics. But the idea of this Franciscan friar, Sean O'Malley, that really inspired them. We would see articles every day in the Italian press. They loved this idea, and it's because he struck them as humble. He struck them as a guy who actually wore sandals. And so they did not elect him, of course, but they elected a man who took the name Francis and wants to make the church of the poor and for the poor. So in a sense, I think it does open the gate a little bit in the future toward the possibility of an American Pope. Thank you very much.